Chapter 13 talks about the sectional crisis as it's emerging in the 1850s. um, and I think it does a good job of kind of giving you a sense for the emerging crisis that's happening. Um, One of the big images here is going to be the fugitive slave law. This particular lithograph describes that in pretty good detail. In addition, this one talks about this map shows the contrast between the free states and the slave states, and then the vast Western territory and the debate over how much is slavery going to expand into these states. So if you're talking about the emerging crisis, you definitely have a crisis with what's going to happen with all this territory. And then you have this question of this moral question about how do we know that the Fugitive Slave Act isn't going to somehow result in, free people being taken? And what does that mean if you can take a free African American? What does that mean for white people, right? Certainly that equation is much different in the North with the people that had undergone the religious revivals and kind of the social changes and the social reform movements. They would be much more sensitive to this than say your average, Southern white person would be. But still, you have this emerging question that happens here. So just to very quickly run through some of the documents. I encourage you to kind of read the introduction. That's always helpful. And then this one right here is saying that Prigg v. Pennsylvania is the Supreme Court essentially arguing that that the fugitive slave law overrides the right of states to be able to dictate freedom for African Americans. So Pennsylvania had a ruling that said that they didn't have to return former slaves. And so the issue here is if they don't have to return former slaves, then that means the fugitive slave law that's passed. And notice this is 1842. So this is before the really tough fugitive slave law of 1850 that basically states can do what they want as far as laws. So it's an interesting, as we're moving into the sectional crisis, if the sectional crisis is based on the notion of states' rights and that states can, that they're concerned that the federal government's going to take their slaves away. In this particular example, you have an example of the Supreme Court asserting federal power over states enforcing the return of runaway slaves. So if you're talking about this question of state power versus federal power, this is a real question. How are we going to handle the issue of slavery, whether it's a state or whether it's the federal government, right? This particular one right here goes into an excerpt from Uncle Tom's Cabin, pointing out kind of the anxiety that many whites had with the fugitive slave law of 1850, that it would force them to violate their own moral code, that somehow being accused of breaking the law because they didn't report runaway slaves or because they gave them food would be something that they would find reprehensible, right? So this is an account between a man and a woman, and she's really kind of laying down the ground of the moral conundrum that is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So I think it does a good job of kind of showing what that was like. This one over Margaretta Mason and Lydia Marie Child discussing John Brown in 1860. This one in particular, I think is will be beneficial because you can really see the concern about the violence that John Brown's raid instigated, as well as kind of this anxiety that about the South and about how essentially, John Brown is standing up for what is right. And so you have kind of this back and forth between these two women discussing the fundamental problem of how the law acts, to keep people enslaved, and how kind of essentially this unjust law is a no law at all, as Martin Luther King will later say. And talks about kind of the rape of African American women, and that that basically whites can behave with impunity and don't have to follow the law. So I think this kind of gives you an insight into the abolitionist mindset, why they're advocating for this, as well as in the anxiety that's present in Southern slaveholders, that ultimately by the time you get to 1860, that this is going to lead to a mass revolt. Now, pay particular attention to the Republican Party platform and the things that it's advocating for. Things in which have to do that all men are created equal, and that the union of the state is the most important thing. That we don't want to have the United States broken apart, and that essentially that the Democratic members have been difficult and refuse to cooperate. They believe that states should have control, and kind of basically set the standard for that secession is not the answer. That the Democratic administration of James Buchanan, things like Bleeding Kansas, have created this extreme sort of violence that they basically lay the blame at the feet of the administration. And they basically talk about that what we need to do is get rid of corruption. They see the government as being horribly corrupt. That the Dred Scott decision has violated kind of the essential beliefs that result in the harmony of the country. This idea that slavery can be taken anywhere, and that basically kind of challenges the question of slavery in new territories. And that they, reject the African slave trade. And they talk about, the Kansas-Nebraska situation a couple of different times. And they talk about tariffs. They talk about, about free soil, about settlers being able to move out west, that sort of thing. That it's kind of a nativist, right? Not nativist, I'm sorry, that basically it's pro-immigration, right? They oppose any change in our naturalization laws, and that they advocate for an international railroad. So this Republican Party platform kind of lays down what the Republican Party is all about. So I think you should keep that in mind, and what parts of that are going to be most insulting to Southerners. Certainly the questions about slavery, the criticism of the Kansas-Nebraska Act are going to be of concern to slave owners. The criticism of the Dred Scott decision. So you can see why the South is going to be extremely upset by a Republican victory in 1860, because they are advocating for a form of government that is completely the opposite of what Southerners are wanting. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of this comes down to the right to take your slaves anywhere in the country that you want to take. This Declaration of Secession clearly asserts the issue of slavery, the right to have slaves, puts forth the idea that they're justified in secession, and that the federal government is violating these things, that, essentially that they have violated the Constitution, and that they have violated their property rights. In relation to slavery. And so I think that this does a really good job of kind of giving you a sense of the emerging tension. So as you read the documents, look for the ways in which they contradict each other, the ways in which you can clearly see that one side of the argument has one very specific set of beliefs, and another side of the argument has another very different set of beliefs. And then you think about that map and you realize that without some kind of major shift, there was going to be a conflict. So hopefully this helps you get through 13 as you think about your reflection, and I look forward to reading it.